stylish at the movies.
Today on Straight Talk Africa, we look at the United Nations General Assembly. Every 5 years, the president of the UNGA comes from Africa. To what extent is this an opportunity for the UNGA to devote its attention to critical African issues? That discussion is coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I am Shaka Ssali, and today we are discussing the significance of having an African at the helm of the United Nations General Assembly.
The United Nations General Assembly is going to be headed by Tanzanian Muhammad-Bande.
The new chief is pledging to focus on peace and prosperity for the most vulnerable. My colleague Paul Ndiho has more on the story.
The United Nations General Assembly is going to be headed by Tanzanian Muhammad-Bande. The world body elected Nigeria's ambassador to the UN to the post last month by acclamation to preside over its upcoming session.
Taking into account the provisions of paragraph 60 of General Assembly decision, I therefore declare His Excellency Tijani Muhammad-Bande of Nigeria elected by acclamation as President of the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly.
The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, focuses on peace and security. Poverty eradication, climate action, and inclusion are among the major priorities for his presidency. Addressing the General Assembly, the newly elected Muhammad-Bande said that the international community must continue to invest in sustainable peace and conflict prevention.
As the United Nations has not met the expectations of its founding fathers in terms of preventing many violent conflicts and mass atrocities, we have to assume collective responsibility to make the world a better, safer, and more peaceful one. The promotion of human rights and the empowerment of women and youth deserve special attention, and I will be devoted to the promotion of gender parity throughout the whole UN system, starting from my own office.
Muhammad-Bande observed that the UN will commemorate the 75th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations, and that presents a unique opportunity to reduce the trust deficit between nations. He says the world shares the same aspirations and must but work together.
The General Assembly must play its role in bridging the gaps and promoting collective action to address all international issues that deserve attention, with close coordination and collaboration with the Secretary General, Security Council, and ECOSOC.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the Nigerian ambassador can bring many relevant and admirable qualifications to the job from his years as the UN representative from Nigeria.
And as a Nigerian and an African, you have invaluable insights into the continent's challenges, such as the Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin, and more broadly, into the challenges our world faces across the three pillars of our work: peace, sustainable development, and human rights.
Tanzanian Muhammad-Bande's election to lead the UN General Assembly could help spotlight insecurity in northern Nigeria, where Boko Haram, the Islamic terrorist group, carries out attacks targeting civilians and the military. In its annual World Report, Human Rights Watch says that despite notable military advances and premature proclamations of Boko Haram's defeat by government forces, the extremist group remains a threat to security in the northeastern region. Abductions, suicide bombings, and attacks on civilian targets by Boko Haram still plagues the Nigerian government. The attacks have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and displaced millions of people. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. Joining me here in the studio are two distinguished guests. Johanna Leblanc a lawyer, a national security and foreign affairs legal strategist, and Ambassador Sidi Sanneh, a former foreign minister of the Gambia. Well, I have to say, Johanna and Sidi, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on this edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you for having me, Shaka.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Let me ask you immediately. We're talking about one of the most important modern institutions that affect nearly everybody globally, the United Nations. And it's quite possible that a lot of people in our audience do not really know much about the United Nations. You know, there are two important parts of the United Nations. There is the United Nations General Assembly that we are focusing on today. And there is, of course, the United Nations Security Council, perhaps the most powerful body on this planet Earth, because it happens to be in charge of global peace and security. What is the difference between the United Nations General Assembly, sometimes referred to as the UNGA, and the UN Security Council?
Okay, thank you, Shaka, for that question. First and foremost, I would like to say congratulations to His Excellency Muhammad-Bande for being elected as the president of the UN General Assembly. He's Nigerian, and I think that he is the second Nigerian to have held this post. The last person who held this post was His Excellency, I believe, Garba from Nigeria in 1989.
General Joseph Garba.
Exactly, 1989, and he worked tirelessly to end apartheid in South Africa and also to decolonize Angola. So I think that to work towards decolonization, rather, of Angola.
Southern Africa.
Yes.
Angola had already, in fact, been, I think, politically independent at the time when he was president.
Exactly.
He probably helped countries like Namibia.
Exactly, Chaka. So, so His Excellency Muhammad Bande has a very huge shoes to fill. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But back to your question in terms of like the difference between the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. Well, with the UN Security Council, they have veto power, right? And a lot of people have said, and it's the reality that the votes that take place at the UN General Assembly are not binding, whereas the votes in the UN Security Council are by the permanent members, and we know those members are, with the power to veto, are the UK, United States, China, Russia, and one more country, and France, obviously. And some have said that actually it shouldn't be this way. The power is not structured appropriately. And my recommendation is that I don't think that we should limit those superpowers to being a member of the UN Security Council, but instead I think we should expand it, because I think Africa, Southeast Asia should also have voting power at the UN Security Council. And we will talk a little bit further about some of the key differences between the two in a few minutes.
Thank you. What about you, Sidi?
Well, I cannot add more to what she has already said in this case. With regards to the General Assembly, I do expect that the present president, Tijani Muhammad-Bande.
We should point out, by the way, that yes, he has been elected to be the next
yes, in September. He has switched office in September.
But he will be sworn in September.
Yes. Yeah, he'll be in September. But he already has a very distinguished career.
Impeccable credentials. Well, looking at his CV,
yes.
You couldn't perhaps have asked for a better person.
No, he's really a very top-notch academician and also a diplomat. And
University administrator?
Yes.
Having been a vice chancellor?
That's right. Yeah.
for university in Nigeria.
Yeah, in Sokoto, Nigeria. I think that he brings in also what I do expect for this General Assembly, given his background, is one issue that has been of great concern in the region. Boko Haram is I think that you will see over the year that he will probably be pushing forward for some form of policy, if you will, or at least to get the General Assembly behind him in trying to make sure that this is addressed, both not only for Boko Haram, but also for the other terrorist organizations that are very active in the sub-region, particularly in Mali and in Burkina Faso. So this is what I would expect coming from him in the next year.
We gather that, of course, Africa gets an opportunity to head the UNGA once every 5 years. What is the significance of that presidency, really? You're talking about, again, the UNGA, which pretty much is like a global parliament, really. And in fact, the president of the UNGA, he probably borrowed from the French diplomatic culture. The president of the UNGA is really like the speaker of the global assembly.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Shaka. And allow me to put some context into this conversation that we're having, this critical conversation around the United Nations General Assembly and the UN Security Council, because I feel as though you cannot have a productive conversation about the UN without speaking about the UN Security Council, because the vote, the power to veto is so critical, and the voting at the UN Security Council are binding, unlike the UN General Assembly.
And who controls the pass?
Exactly. So
the UN Security Council, correct?
Exactly. So let me add a little bit more context, and I think that you know, for the sake of this conversation, right, there will be some recommendations that I will make in terms to for the UN to run more efficient and more effective, especially in the context of the continent of Africa. But one thing I can say is, if we did not have the UN body today, I think there would be a conversation amongst scholars and heads of states on how to create a system like the UN to address some of our issues and concerns, right? While the UN has made some mistakes, right? And let's be frank for the purpose of this conversation. But the UN has also done some good. And the UN, just like any institution in the world, there are some good elements and some bad elements.
I think it has done very well on balance, because let's face it, the last time we had what you would call a world war was, in fact, before the UN came into being.
Exactly. Exactly. And back to your question earlier, what is the significance of having a leader from the continent to now lead the General Assembly? What it means is that the agenda of the continent will be at the very forefront, right?
You set the agenda.
You set the agenda, just like you said, the Speaker of the House in the U.S., in essence, sets the agenda. So I think that the issues and the security issues impacting the continent and economic issues and such will be placed on the agenda and will be properly addressed because we have representation at the table.
The Speaker of the United States House of Representatives decides which bills actually can come on the table for debate. Does that also mean that if you are the president of the UNGA, you can actually play the same kind of role?
I mean, you do have influence, right? There is a level of influence, but however, we must keep in mind that the UN General Assembly, the resolutions that are passed, are not binding, you know, and I think that is a critical problem, and I think that there has to be a way for the UN to address this, because if we all come together with a resolution to, let's say, to handle poverty in the continent of Africa, right, on the continent of Africa, but the resolution does not have any teeth, then what does that mean, right? Are we really being efficient and effective? And we must look at those things.
Ambassador, you were once the foreign minister of your country, the Gambia. You must have had, of course, an opportunity where you had to interact with the United Nations.
Yes.
How do you look at the UN? When you interact with the UN, with your colleagues and what have you, to what extent do you, in fact, take interaction with the UN General Assembly seriously?
Well, I think it is a very important forum. It is a world forum. It acts as a parliament, if you will, with the president as the speaker. Of course, if it is in the case of the African president or even the Asian president, usually you'll have the Security Council members, if they are in a position to influence them. But all the same, you still have, regardless of the fact that you are from Africa or from one of the smaller countries, you do have a great deal of influence in the agenda, setting it up. And as I said earlier, I think that you will see, not only in the case of Nigeria, to have the terrorism taking a prominent position in the agenda of coming year, but you'll also see some economic issues coming in, because there's, in Africa now, we're talking about a trade association or union amongst the African countries. So the issues of trade will perhaps also be something that is going to play a very critical role during Muhammad-Bande's presidency this year.
We know that the UN, for example, came into being back in 1945. And during that time, there were only 4 African countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa, except that, of course, South Africa was run by a minority white regime. When you look at that period, and you look at this period now, the African countries are probably in the majority at the United Nations. Who would you say that so far has been the most either prominent or most effective or most respected president of the UNGA that represented the African bloc?
That's a very difficult.
He's going to get you in trouble.
I know.
You're going to get in trouble, Shaka.
That's a very difficult one to really judge. But you do have, as I said, the power, relative power of the African presidents of the UNGA slightly lower than you would expect from bigger countries with bigger economies. But in the case of the African presidencies, Nigeria, of course, Nigeria, by virtue of their size, being the lead power in Africa, certainly their national would carry a lot more weight.
What about Ghana?
Ghana,
there was a time when Ghana was probably the African regional superpower.
He was the first. Alex Kwesi-Nsaki was the first black African president of the UNGA.
But what about the fact that also during that period, at least I was taught that when I was an undergraduate in university, that during that time, because of the leadership of the founding president of Ghana,
yes,
the Osajefo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana was the African political superpower, yes, to the extent that sometimes it was a bit embarrassing if you were asked where do you come from, and you said you are from Nigeria. The next question would be, where exactly do you come from in Ghana? In other words, where exactly is Nigeria in Ghana?
Yes. Ghana has always played a very, very important role in the decolonization of the continent, being the first African country,
first black
African country to gain independence in '57. They were also blessed, of course, with leadership that was known worldwide. I think this is something that I mentioned to you earlier, is that the leadership of the country is equally important, if not as important as the president that is heading the UNGA.
Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was arguably among, if not the most educated head of state at that time, having earned a PhD.
Yes. So really, I think it is very important to have the national leadership also being there to take the lead as well. There is another country that is my neighbor, Senegal, although they have never been president of the UNGA, but in the diplomatic field they have been very well respected over the years, particularly during Senghor's period.
Leopold Sédar Senghor, the man who came close to winning a Nobel Prize for literature.
And also, of course, in my own case in the Gambia, we were batting beyond our class, of course.
Really?
During the time of Sadauda Kairaba Jawara, because he has been very much involved and very active in the international diplomatic field over the years.
So what about in 2014? There was the president of the UN General Assembly was Mr. Sam Kahamba Kutesa, the Ugandan Minister of Foreign Affairs. He basically, promoted some very, very important issues here. We're talking about the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs.
Which are usually to alleviate, to reduce poverty or alleviate poverty, right?
Right.
As well as security throughout the continent. And
promote gender equality.
Exactly. Those were very...
access quality education.
Absolutely.
Healthcare.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but they say that the devil is in the details. How about the implementation?
And I think it goes back to what His Excellency indicated. The leader of the countries throughout the continent are just as important as the representation that we have at the UN General Assembly, right? Because you can have great ideas, you can have amazing ideals, right? But if the leaders of those countries are not in a position to implement some of those amazing ideas, then it's considered failure, right? And I think that's what His Excellency was mentioned earlier, that it's important. Leadership is just as, in the respective country is just as relevant as who leads the UN General Assembly.
Depending on whom you ask about the MDGs, you will get 3 or 4 different reactions to them. From one, those who are very much in support of it and have been the promoters and or drivers of the MDGs. Jeffrey Sachs comes to mind.
Yes.
He will tell you that these are international global commitments on the part of the world community to come around to those ideals of promoting gender equality, alleviating poverty, and all of the other issues concerned. And then you also will find others who will say that it is not only ambitious, but I think it is not been thought through very well. Then you have the group that would say that it is actually even a distraction in the sense that the issue of income inequality, not only at the individual level, but at the country level, unless it is addressed, there is no point really talking about the MDGs. So you've got all the wide spectrum of people with various views. Being the eternal optimist that I am, I do believe that the MDGs do have a very important role to play, and that especially in the areas of accessibility to education and also the alleviation of poverty. They have registered some improvements in it. One could argue that perhaps maybe they could have done more, but I would rather see the current MDGs being at least trying to address the issues that are involved.
How far, for example, has poverty alleviation really gone? I mean, how do you keep hearing people talking about poverty alleviation, and poverty seems to be continuing to pretty much expand, really.
Well, not according to the figures. The figures will show you that, in fact, there has been a reduction in the rate of increase in poverty.
Whose figures?
These are the UN figures.
Isn't it possible that some of those figures could be a reflection or a result of what some would call creative accounting?
Yeah, well, that's also possible. But I think no. But I think also, I mean, if you, I have not really looked at the recent academic papers on this, but I would generally say that the UN do have really very reliable and respectable figures.
Yes, credible figures. Yes. What about gender equality?
I think that to have gender equality as one of the areas that the international community should focus on, I think that's critical, because as we know, like they always say, because when it comes to gender equality, you also have to look at education, right? Are we educating women? There's a saying that says that when you educate a woman, you educate an entire village and ultimately an entire country, right? So in order
that when you educate a boy, you end up educating an individual, a man?
Some have said that. I'm not going to debate.
But is that really true?
I don't want any issues. But what I do know is when you educate a girl, you educate a village and ultimately an entire community. And I think it's critical. In order to reach gender equality, women and girls have to be equipped. They have to be provided with the necessary tools, such as job training, access to quality education, and not just education. Quality education. Because there's a difference.
What is the difference?
Quality education is the education that sets you for success, right, in the future. There is no reason why...
Gives you specific
skills and
skill sets
and tools to maneuver...
That can bring food on the table?
That can bring about economic prosperity, right, for your family, right? So whenever I see education as one of the goals for any given institution or agency, I ask myself, where is quality education? Because, for example, a lot of people have access to education, right? Yeah. But does that education prepare them to start a business, right? Or to be able to feed their families? And that's the question. So for me to see that as one of the main key areas of development, I think it's very critical.
When you talk about education, and it is very, very significant that you point out the difference between simply accessing people to an educational system and making sure that that system is in fact a reflection of quality education.
Absolutely.
It is very important because when you actually look across many African countries, the first people that in fact come up with a vote of no confidence in their own educational systems are the leaders and the elite of that particular country who head the governments. How do they do that? They do that by making sure that their children do not, in fact, go to those type of schools.
Well, I think that's the issue.
They send them outside.
Absolutely, I think that's
private schools.
That's the issue. When you are benefiting from a system as a leader, as a head of state, you ensure that that system is strong enough to accommodate your needs and the needs of your family, right? But when your family, when your family members are not recipients of that system, it no longer becomes something of personal interest, right? In a sense, it's kind of like, I'm not benefiting from this. yes, I see there's an issue there. However, because I can send my child to school in the UK, in the United States, it no longer becomes a primary factor. But I think that for you to reach gender equality, education has to be at the very forefront of our conversation. And I think that key priority should remain the UN's goals for a very long time. In fact, forever, if you ask me, because we can always improve in the area of gender equality as it pertains to the continent of Africa.
I see. Well, time, of course, happens not to be our best ally, and for that, you are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of our discussion in a moment, so please don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about, sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives. Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices
With me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka.
It's time for Our Voices.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. Call us now with your questions and comments. The number is 202-619-3111, and the U.S. country code is 1. Call us direct and we'll call you right back. Remember to turn down the volume on your radio or television and keep your comments brief. Now back to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gizi Uwat, and we appreciate all of our audience feedback. Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook. You can watch our show there and leave a comment. Now let's look at what's on tap for next week's program.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, historically black colleges and universities in the United States are a source of great pride for African Americans. HBCUs have also educated prominent Africans like the founding presidents of Nigeria, Ghana, and Malawi. The role of historically black colleges and universities on the continent on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Today we are talking about an African leading the United Nations General Assembly. Our distinguished guests are Johanna Leblanc, a lawyer and national security and foreign affairs legal strategist, and Ambassador Sidi Sanneh, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Gambia. Johanna and Sidi, again I have to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa on this edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Again, thank you, Shaka.
Thank you. You're most welcome. Well, you know, it's very unfortunate that you had a point, but unfortunately there happens to be no democracy in Studio 47. And so when the orders come, it's like a good soldier on parade. Mm-hmm. You do not ask questions. Mm-hmm. When they say about turn, you just go about turn.
You execute.
So I hope that you'll find some space in your beautiful Haitian heart to forgive me
Absolutely,
for
Shaka.
interjecting.
Absolutely, Shaka.
You're most
You're
welcome.
forgiven.
Could you pick up from where you left and complete your point, please?
We were talking about gender equality. So in order for that goal to become a reality, we have to focus on the education and the quality of education that girls throughout the continent receives. And as I said earlier, when the leaders, when the heads of states don't have to benefit from that education, right? When their children don't have to benefit from a broken education system, they no longer belongs a priority. For me, if I know if this is broken, it's going to impact my investment, because children are investments. Some of us look at it that way, right? if I know it's going to impact my investment, I will ensure that that system is created in a way that would not compromise my investment. So I think that's one of the issues. So education is one of the areas to improve gender equality. But there's also the training of the men as well, because a lot of times when we have discussions about gender equality, we don't include the men. They have to understand how the lack of gender equality essentially undermines democracy throughout the continent of Africa. It undermines a lot of the policy proposals. And men...
The family unit.
Exactly.
Society.
Exactly.
And the country and the global world, really.
Exactly.
So do you think perhaps that what is needed is a fundamental changes in both men's and women's attitudes and mindsets about these things? Absolutely, because there's another element as well, right? So we have education, we have boys that have to be trained about the importance of gender equality and incorporating women in different discussions and in different institutions. And not just having them there, but having women in these institutions as a key player. Having women as players, right, and who are able to set policies and who are able to implement policies. Because sometimes you go to an institution, you see that the women or the girls, they're at the front desk, right? But who are making the decisions are usually the men, right? So we have to look at that as well to make sure that women are included in the policy discussions, right? And that's the only way that we can reach gender equality throughout the continent of Africa and even here in the United States. But when you talk about leadership and you talk about how women should and indeed must be included, are you not in fact perhaps looking at the women elite? So what about the ordinary woman? And my recommendation is not just for the elite women, it's for the ordinary women, right? Because I know the ordinary woman rather, because I know the elite women oftentimes they have access to these systems, but because of gender equality, they too have challenges, believe it or not. Because I have met women who are of power, right, who have status in various societies throughout the continent of Africa, but they can't really voice their concerns because your job as a woman is to take the back seat. You see, I'll never forget this. I'll share a very brief story with you. I was on a flight from Johannesburg, and I think I was going to Malawi. And then the gentleman sat next to me, and he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going there to do research. I'm doing my doctorate." And he said, "Are you married?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, this is why you're not married. You have too much education." Right? So sometimes when women are educated, when women are vocal, they call them troublemakers, right? So because of that, women sometimes don't even want to take the front seat because they don't want to be seen as such. And I know these are very small nuances, right, that we're discussing, but they make an impact, ultimately. Very interesting.
Yeah, I would just like to say that there is another element in education that I have, that most of us who have been in the field of education, because I was also at one time in the Ministry of Education for some time, and in the rural setting, the first thing that you would like to do is to stress the importance of having the girls enrolled in schools. Most of them don't. And this is where I believe that you have something like the MDG plays a very critical role in a country like the Gambia, for instance, where 70% of the population is rural-based. They depend on rural economy. And then the sizable amount of the population lives there. Now, if they are not properly educated, or at least have them access to education, this is one big detriment to the development process. So we focus most of our attention on having gained access for girls to go to school. Then you want them to you retain them in school as well. Enrollment is one thing, but we also discovered that retaining them throughout the cycle, primary cycle, is also a big challenge.
And you know, to piggyback on what His Excellency said, I was actually doing some work in Zimbabwe last year with the rural teachers of Zimbabwe. And one of the issues that I learned about is that some of the girls were not, in the rural areas rather, were not going to school because when their cycle would come on, they did not have sanitary pads. So that impacted their ability to attend school. So I know that, you know, while my proposals may seem to be very broad, but I do understand the nuances, the challenges. But that's why it's important to have an aggressive and robust gender equality plan in place for the entire continent and address some of these issues, such as girls not even having access to sanitary pads. And because of that, they cannot attend school.
Let's talk a bit about those who believe and think that there is a need for the UN reforms. That in fact, that should have happened yesterday. Because we can't go on having an institution that makes decisions that are pertinent, you know, to really everybody you can think about globally, and yet there are only 5 countries which are the drivers, really. We're talking about 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. You're talking about the United States. You're talking about the United Kingdom. You're talking about France. You're talking about Russia. And you're talking about China. As a matter of fact, the last time I checked, Africa is not represented. Latin America is also missing in action.
In Southeast Asia.
How could that be?
Well, I guess you will have to start with the genesis of the UN itself, you know, after World War II.
World War II.
These were the powers that be.
That succeeded.
The Bretton Woods institutions came into being, and you will find them there. The same power structure that you find in the United Nations as a whole, you find in the World Bank and the IMF.
Right, the Bretton Woods institutions.
The Bretton Woods institutions. So it's one and the same.
But what about the fact that we studied somewhere that the UN system was supposed to reflect to a large extent the United States system of government? And yet, when you come to the United States, you are talking about checks and balances. When you talk about veto power here in the United States, you know that the veto power can in fact be overridden by Congress. But veto power at the United Nations in New York cannot be overridden by the General Assembly. It can only be overridden by another permanent representative of the Security Council by casting its veto. Just like the United States did, not once, but twice, when it decided that Dr. Boutros Ghali of Egypt could not get the second term as the Secretary General of the UN.
Well, it is obvious that the UN system trying to mimic the United Nations or United States model of government was not quite 100%, because for the same reasons that you have cited, that there is no veto power. There was a lot of talk in the last decade about the restructuring the Security Council.
Especially, in fact, during the UN Secretary Generalship of Kofi Annan. The late Kofi Annan.
Yes. Nigeria, South Africa, but whatever happened to it is still not clear to me. But obviously there is a need, particularly now. If you look at the structure, the world order, if you will, it is changing, and it is changing in very interesting ways. One, you have the emergence of China, so they have to make room for China. whether they are reluctant or whether they like it or not.
You know, China already has at least the veto power.
It does have the veto power, but on the economic side of things, because it's also, you cannot separate the two, because usually they correlate one another. They correlate. That the power, economic power that China is right now experiencing, or at least is building up to, is going to be a #1 challenge to the United States. Then you also have, on the other hand, you have African countries like Nigeria, South Africa, the Arab countries north. They are
you
also,
have Turkey.
They are also.
You have Brazil.
Yes, you have. I mean, I'm going with the African continent first, and then you come to the, South Africa. I'm sorry, the Latin American countries. So there is that shift.
You have India.
You have India, but you also have, on the other hand, you have this new dynamics that is playing, with Russia on one hand trying to make sure that the old order is somehow disrupted. So there is a possibility.
Is it disrupted or is maintained?
Well, no, I think that what they would like to see is that the Northern Alliance, of the North Atlantic Alliance, for instance, and the European Union, it's not as unified as they are now.
But when you think about it, isn't Russia a European country?
Yes, it is a European country, but again, I think that there is the ideological characteristic of the country. I think is more important.
Different.
Yes.
But now you have at least 2 legitimate European countries, Britain and France, which are members of the UN Security Council. And frankly, when you compare them and trust them and compare and contrast them with some of the African countries like Nigeria, like South Africa, like other countries in Latin America like Brazil and what have you, who really do you think is more deserving?
Well, I mean, to share power is something that is not easily attainable when you are on the other side trying to get in. That is just a fact.
Power is not ceded. It is not manna. It is not like expecting manna to fall from heaven.
Yeah, no, but again, the onus will fall on us as Africans.
Right.
The African leadership must also bear some responsibility in making sure that they are very well represented. They are equally represented in the world body. And I say this because Nigeria, and about a decade ago, this was a very lively discussion. But suddenly it has seemed to be very quiet now.
What about
the reason why, I don't know.
What about the fact that when you look at the birth rate, Africa seems to me that in the next 20 or 30 years will probably be home to a majority on this planet Earth, and yet will not be reflected in the political dynamics of the UN Security Council.
But it will also be, however populous we are, it will also be in the year 2050, at the current rate at which income disparity between the rich and the poor continues to grow, 80% of the poorest of the poor, you will find them in Africa.
But why is that so really when, in fact, let's face it, Africa, on the contrary, is arguably the richest, the wealthiest continent on this planet Earth, and yet home to the poorest human beings on this planet Earth.
And it is going to grow worse if we do not stop the slide, one of the reasons why, in my view, is the fact that the leadership is poor.
So you agree with those people who say that you are talking about a continent suffering a leadership deficit?
Yes.
A continent having leaders that have no vision.
They have no vision. They don't have any national view of their own countries. They tend to be self-centered. They don't look at the interest of the country, national interest. It is personal interest. It is sectional interest. These are the issues. Of course, corruption is one. This is what I have been doing lately, by the way, in trying to see how best we can reduce that scourge that is really holding us back as a continent and also individually.
Where are leaders like the Osajefo, the Ghanaian, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the kid from Nkrofur? Where are they when Africa needs them? Because you're talking about a man, sincerely, who helped Ghana, the Gold Coast then, to regain her political independence on March 6, 1957. He did not celebrate. He did not pump his chest. Rather, what he did was to challenge the people of Ghana and the people of Africa that the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of the rest of the African continent. And he did not simply talk the talk, by the way. He basically walked that particular talk by making sure that he provided the necessary tools to the brothers, sisters, and cousins, and what have you, who were fighting European colonialism and imperialism.
Shaka, I agree with His Excellency partly in terms of the leaders of the continent must take responsibility for where the various countries in Africa are today. But there's another part that we're not discussing, like what happened up to the Berlin Conference, right? Let's talk about colonization of African countries.
The 1884?
Yes, the Berlin Conference. What happened, right?
With not a single African present.
Exactly. So we have to look at the exploitation, the constant exploitation of Africans, of resources in Africa by various superpowers, right? Because we cannot simply blame the leaders. Yes, they do play a role in where the continent is and the failure of eradicating poverty and corruption and economic sustainability for various countries.
I think it is legitimate to criticize the modern African leadership in the context of the earlier African leadership. When you go to Tanzania, for example, you had this great man by the name Mwalimu Kambarage, Julius Kambarage Nyerere. When you go to Zambia, you had the founding president, Dr. David Kenneth Kaunda. When you went to Guinea-Conakry, you found people like Sekou Touré. When you went to Mali, you found people like Modibo Keita. You went to Cairo, you had a Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Absolutely.
When you went to Algiers, you had a man called Ben Bera. These are people who neither had borders or boundaries in their minds.
Absolutely.
For them, it was Africa.
Exactly. And I think these are all relevant points, but we have to look at context, right? You have, for example, the Francophone countries in Africa. they're not responsible for their currency. How do you have a country who is not responsible for its very own currency? If you don't have control of your currency, what do you have? And you have to look at how France has the first right of refusal when certain minerals are found. So I think in order for the conversation to be productive, we have to look at all the key players. We have to look at foreign policies coming out of Washington, D.C. and signed into legislation as 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, right? And we also look at the policies at the UN. I think everybody plays a role in where Africa is today. And only collectively will be able to get out of where we are today as a continent.
Let's go back to the point that you raised, because it is very, very significant, the issue of not having a currency. If you came from Francophone Africa, yeah, but what currency are they using? Is it still the CFA? But how could they possibly use the CFA when the last time I checked, the French themselves no longer actually use that currency? They use the euro. Any particular reason why Francophone Africa does not use the euro?
And I think these are conversations that heads of states in Francophone countries throughout Africa have to consider. Like, why is it the currency is what it is today? Why don't you have control over much more of your resources and the future of your nation? But aside from that, as I said earlier, we have to look at this from a global perspective. What role does the UN play in this? What role does the United States Congress play? What role does other heads of states? And back to the UN Security Council, yes, I agree that Africa should have veto power, should be one of the key members. However, it cannot be a single country. You cannot have a country like Lesotho, represented at the UN Security Council. First, I don't think that would ever happen. And second, I think that it needs to be collectively. It needs to be one Africa, one voice, and become a member of the UN Security Council with the power to veto. Because without having that significant power as a continent, we won't be able to get our interest placed on the table and influence what happens. Because I can assure you, Russia, the United States, France, they are not voting against their interest. They're not. But when you're not at the table, when you don't have the power to vote, guess what happens? You're on the menu.
Yeah, I think, yes, you have a point. In fact, when I mentioned put the onus on the African leadership, it's for a reason. And that reason is that we are supposed to be independent, sovereign countries. Now we should be the ones at the driver's seat, and not, say, Britain or France.
Well, unfortunately, Ambassador Sanneh, time is not our best ally. We'll have more discussion next time. On that note, our guests today were Johanna Leblanc and Ambassador Sidi Sanneh. Thanks to our audience for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter Africa, and please remember to keep the African hopes alive.